Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod here to talk about first place Michigan State and their upcoming game on the road against Maryland Terrapins. Quick thanks to all of you for making the show so popular. We appreciate it. Tiff Knots is now number 35 in the country for all basketball podcasts. And our YouTube channel has grown over 20% just the last month. So certainly helped a lot by Michigan State winning. And also all of you tuning in, we really appreciate it. Please continue to subscribe, share it with friends and other Spartan fans. We really appreciate that. And we're committed to continue to bring you the top Michigan State basketball content on the interwebs. So if you want to learn ways to support the show, you can head on over to tffindots.com/support, where you can find ways to do so. All right, Rod, Michigan State, as I mentioned, returns to action on Wednesday night. They travel to College Park to take on Maryland. The Terrapins are 21-6 overall, 11-5 in the Big Ten. They're on a 4-game winning streak. It seems like Michigan State runs to all these teams on winning streaks right now. I guess aside from Purdue, losing quite a bit. They're 10-2 over the last 12 games. They're 15th in KenPom, 12th in the net, which by comparison, Michigan State is 11th in KenPom and 15th in the net. On offense, Maryland is 17th, and they're not the usual Terrapin teams we've seen of old. They can shoot real well. They're 37.5% from three. They're 55th on twos, and they don't shoot the ball over a whole lot. They're 36. They don't don't actually draw fouls very much. They're 205th in foul rate, which is really weird compared to the Maryland teams, with Turgeon and then even with Willard. And they're also not a very good offensive rebounding team. They're only 101st. So definitely a different offensive profile than the past.
It is. It's a very different one. We're used to, if you think back to certainly the entirety of the Turgeon era, and then even the first couple years of the Kevin Willard era, and it had to do with personnel. He recruited Jameer Young to be his point guard for his first 2 years, and Jameer Young happened to play a lot like Turgeon point guards, in that he was a downhill guy that drew a lot of contact. But this team, not like that at all. Again, sub 200 in foul rate, but they shoot the ball exceptionally well and they handle it well. They don't make a ton of mistakes. And then on the other end, things that are different, not a great offensive rebounding team. And that's surprising to me when you look at their roster, particularly those two bigs. You
Right.
would
Yeah.
think those two guys alone would probably make them a better offensive rebounding team than they are, but for whatever reason, it just hasn't happened. So it's a very good offensive team, just different in terms of the way they're going about it. Where they got a lot of shot makers.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line. They get if you can get a lot of shots up because you don't turn it over and you hit a lot of them, you're probably going to be a pretty good offense, and that's what they've been.
Yeah. I think the only time I've watched a couple of Maryland games, but I felt like they looked really good against the boards against Iowa, but then Iowa makes everyone look really good in the board. So that's not a
That's
good,
it. I mean,
not a
the
good example.
100, 100 and 101st isn't like, oh my God, they just
No,
never get a second shot. But by Big Ten standards, it's not great.
Yeah.
In the
Well,
Big
and
Ten, you know how it is. In the Big Ten, if you're a decent, solid rebounding team, you're probably going to be somewhere in the top 50 or 60 at worst
right.
nationally, and they're well outside of that.
Yeah. Well, and they've got those Reese and Queen. You'd expect them to be a lot better, but
Right.
they're at least that. But then just to I guess to point out, they are better defensively. And so on defense, the Terps are also very good, which is not surprising since they are sitting with only 5 losses in the league at 11-5. They're number 20 for defense, so they kind of do everything pretty well. They're 45th against the threes. They're 77th against twos. 30th in defensive rebounding, so very good at cleaning the boards. And they don't foul a whole lot, so number 32 in opponent foul rate. They're 58th in opponent turnover rates. They turn you over a decent amount, but only 114th in steals. So a lot of them are just kind of, I don't know, like moving screens, I suppose, and stuff. They're 63rd in block rate.
Throwing the
So
ball out of bounds.
yeah, right, that
Yeah.
sort of thing. Yeah. So
Traveling.
yeah, they're 63rd in block rate. So the size helps a little bit around the rim. And finally, they just, from a tempo standpoint, they're 53rd in overall tempo, 26 in average length of offensive possession. I feel like this year we've seen a whole lot more speed and tempo in the Big Ten than we have in the past.
There is no question. I don't think that is just an anecdotal impression. I think if you look at the pace of play and especially the average length of offensive possessions, for teams around the league this year. It is drastically different than what we're used to seeing. You look at Maryland, for example, was a team that has not been particularly fast since they've been in the conference. Well, they are this year.
Mhm.
Wisconsin, a dramatic
Yeah,
difference.
right.
What were you
That
seeing?
alone changes the effort.
Michigan, a dramatic defense than or a change than difference than what we've seen in Christ go forever. They're playing very fast. Iowa does what Iowa's always done. There's still some teams that play a slow pace, Minnesota, Northwestern, but it's not like it used to be where you could look around and say 80% of the league played pretty slowly.
Right.
It's not that anymore. So no, I think you're absolutely right. Turning to their defense for a second, yeah, it's interesting because they're not incredible in any one area, but they're just really solid across the board. Like you look at that, their defense against shots from the floor, 45th against threes, 77th against twos. Well, neither of those numbers says, "Oh my God, that's a lockdown group,"
Yeah.
but they're good. And when you rebound those misses that you're generating, and they're 30th there in defensive rebounding, okay, that's going to be solid. You're 32nd in foul rate. You're not putting opponents on the line very much. So all of those things, 58th in opponent turnover rate for whatever reason, and it's not like they're ball hawking, but they're generating a good amount of opponent mistakes. So you put the whole picture together and you get a very strong overall defensive team, even though there's not any one area that you're like, wow, that's just elite. Like
Sure.
Michigan State, you can say the defense against threes, which we don't talk about much, but it's by percentage, it's been phenomenal. Sub
Yeah.
30%. And defensive rebounding are elite areas, you know. Maryland doesn't have that, but they're just really good, solid everywhere. You do that, you're going to end up being pretty damn good overall, and that's what they are. So you look at this team and the whole picture, not a lot of holes. I mean, the
Yeah.
biggest hole is that they don't get to the line much on offense. That's really and their offensive rebounding isn't great. That's about it.
Yeah. It's interesting, looking at a team, well, for the turnover percentage, I wonder too, also, if you play just solid, sound defense, you're going to get people traveling as they try and go too fast and
100%.
try and play a little out of
Yeah.
themselves, passing out of bounds, like you mentioned. I think that's probably part of it.
Well, and
Um,
and I'll note this, particularly in a league where, as we just talked about, you got a lot of teams that want to play fast. And
yeah,
if you're able to force those teams to have to go 25, 26, 27 seconds into the shot clock, yeah, then those teams especially might be susceptible to it.
right. Well, Maryland is a team that you picked, I think, ninth. And so I think, of course, in the beginning of the season, it's almost impossible to try and get any feel for really what teams are going to be, because you can look at rosters, you can look at, there's so many transfers. You can only guess at sort of how these teams are going to fit together, how the players. And I think, we can look at Kansas for as a good example. AJ Story, he goes there and he's been basically a bust for them.
Yep.
Uh, and so you can take a great producer and someone who looks like fantastic, put them in a different situation, and you get a different result. I mean, if you're someone who cooks a lot, this is the case, right? You have the wrong ingredient and it just doesn't seem to work if it's in the wrong recipe. So anyway, so then Maryland has overperformed, and in some respects, this is probably the best that Wheeler has been, I think, since he's been there.
Oh,
Right?
without question.
Yeah, I mean, so this is
Yeah.
finally they kind
Because
of figured things out, I think.
2 years ago, they were pretty good, but not, pretty good was, oh, they're a tournament team. And then
Yeah,
last year they weren't very good at all. It was a disappointing year. Even though they brought some guys back, it just didn't work. This is clearly his best team because not only are they obviously going to be a tournament team, but you can make a case that this Maryland team, at least in my opinion, has a chance to do some damage.
yeah,
We haven't seen draws yet. Obviously, we got to finish out the regular season first, all of that. But as of now, I look at this Maryland team and I think as much as you can, and I don't want to fall into this trap. I'm always entertained by people saying, "Oh, that's Sweet 16's the furthest they can go." How the hell do you know?
No, I know.
You can't know. It's ridiculous. It's
Yeah,
ridiculous to say stuff like that. But I can say this: there's no obvious reason why you would look at this Maryland team and say, "Boy, that's a team that just doesn't have a chance to go on a run,"
sure.
because they do everything well enough, they're versatile enough that, and consistent enough that I think, there's no reason to put a cap on them and say, well, they should just be happy to get into the tournament. No, I think there's potential there. Again, who they draw and how they're playing at the time those games happen and all of that is going to matter. But that's a good team. That's probably the best, simplest way to say it. That's a good team. And when you consider that this game is on the road for Michigan State, you can make an argument that this is the toughest game they will have played all year in the Big Ten.
Okay.
I'm not saying I'm 100% convinced of that, but you can make an argument.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you could safely say it's the hardest game remaining in the schedule. That one, I think you
For
can say
sure. Oh,
pretty
that's for
confidently.
sure.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
And
And I say that in part because MSU didn't have to go to Mackey.
right. Yeah.
They didn't have to go to Kohl Center. So those are other games that would have been contenders for that were off the board. So when you look at it, you say, well, what were the other toughest games? You could say at UCLA, but you know, we were there. What as an environment, that was 50-50, right?
Right. Environment, but of course you are still on the road, which makes
You
it
are,
harder.
but I
Yeah.
would I would say that the objectively toughest ones at Illinois, at least on paper, maybe not by the time MSU had to play that game.
Yeah.
Certainly at Michigan would have looked like one because of the environment. Those would have been the contenders for that.
Right.
And I think there's a good argument that this game is tougher than those were. At least on paper. We're going to see how it plays out when they actually, play the game. But
Right.
it does have that feel to it, and a lot of that is because I just think that highly of the way Maryland's playing. Like to me, that's a good basketball team right now.
Yeah. And so Maryland is 11-5. So their chance of winning the Big Ten, they got to, run the table and they need a little bit of help, obviously. I mean, I
That's
think
not happening. That's
right. I
not
think,
happening.
I think it's not unreasonable to imagine them as a double bye team though, because you're looking
Yes.
at Michigan State, barring a collapse, is pretty much guaranteed a double bye. I think at this point, they'd have to lose like 3 or 4 to down the stretch. I think to not get that. Michigan probably is too. I mean, they'd have to also have a pretty big collapse, which is, I suppose, possible. But and outside of that, I think really the battles for those final 2 spots, whether it could be Wisconsin or Maryland or UCLA. I mean, it's got to be somebody or
Oh,
Purdue
so
even.
here's the deal. So right now you've got Purdue, Maryland, and Wisconsin all with 5 losses, right? As we're
Right,
recording this, Purdue is
going to win. Right.
no, they're dead even. Indiana's made a huge comeback in the first 5 minutes
Oh
of the
my.
second half, and it's 39 all. Trey
Okay.
Kaufman is shooting free throws. That's why I paused. He might have had a chance to give him the lead, but he missed. Anyway, if Purdue were to lose that game, that would be 6. I think you're right. Although both Michigan and Michigan State have difficult games remaining on their schedule, but right now you would say those teams are definitely have a leg up clearly because they're 2 games up on the other 3
Yeah.
with basically 4 to play. Uh, but it's those 3 teams, Wisconsin, Purdue, and Maryland for 2 spots. So yeah, you would say Wisconsin's got a good shot because um,
Yeah, their
everybody
schedule's soft
believes.
outside of Michigan State.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Michigan State game, if they lose that gets them to 6 losses, but they will be favored in their other games.
Right. But we
I
said that
haven't
before they
actually.
played Oregon and they lost. They
Yeah,
lost at
right.
home to Oregon
Exactly.
too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that goes to show you, don't go counting chickens. But Maryland's clearly in that mix. There's no doubt about that, right?
Yeah.
And it's just they're a good team, man. I just can't put it any more simply than that. And as we're gonna go through their roster, they're not a deep team, but that starting five, I think you can pretty right now, I would be inclined to say that starting five is as good as anybody's in the conference. I think they come up a little bit short when you get to their bench compared to a couple other teams. But that starting five, man, it's you talked about, building a roster and new guys and having difficulty evaluating who's going to click who doesn't, and that's definitely true. Uh, but boy, they got it right. I mean, three portal additions at the guard spots, and then a freshman who everybody figured was going to be good, but has been even
Yeah.
better than I think anyone thought. And then Reese is the only returning starter. So this is very much a new team. And what's interesting about it is it's also um, he didn't load up on fifth year guys. Like some of the transfers he took are, at least in theory, multi-year guys. So Maryland could have some of this group back next year potentially. Not all of them, not Derrick Queen, but but a lot of these guys.
Well, it's fair to say they don't have a high ceiling, of course, in the Big Ten for a team, but that's just a joke, of course. All right, so moving on to closing lineup brought to you by the Brothers Just Keep Gutters. Snow's melting a little bit out here, so anyway, got to make sure those gutters are functioning properly. And I know you have gutters if you're listening in the state of Michigan because it rains and there's lots of snow melting. There's all kinds of problems with weather. So make sure you have your functioning gutters. Super important. And the super guys that take care of that are the Brothers Just Do Gutters. You can head on over to our support page to find ways to get an estimate from them, either on the west side or the east side of the state at tffinots.com/support. And you get 10% off. You mentioned Final Four, and Greg and Kurt will hook you up and take care of things. They'll get on the wires, do all that stuff that needs to be done, whether it's just cleaning out, repairing, replacing. They can do it, and they'll sponsor the player that Michigan is keeping the gutter. We'll start with the starters here. Jacoby Gillespie, 6'1" junior point guard. He transferred from Belmont. He has been really, really good for the team. It's almost averaging 15 points a game, 48, 43, and 83 shooting, almost 5 assists a game with a little under 2 turnovers a game. So good assist turnover ratio. He has also a pass in defense with almost 2 steals a game.
Yeah, I think for as much talk, and rightly so, as their twin towers get, their two bigs, Gillespie is the biggest reason why they are the team that they are. I mentioned they had Jameer Young the last couple of years, and he was very good for Maryland. But I think Gillespie is, at least to date, has been better. And the reason I say that is Young was more of a boom bust guy. He wasn't a consistent jump shooter. I think he was a bit more mistake prone at times, although he certainly was a playmaker. But Gillespie just doesn't make mistakes all that often. He's disruptive on defense, and on offense, man, you can't walk the balance much better between running an offense and going and getting your own and being a consistent. By the way, Indiana's up 8 with a chance to make it 9 in a second, so they completely turned this game around.
Woodson's a genius. Go ahead.
Yeah, coach of the year. But yeah, I mean, you can't ask for a better balance from your floor leader, your point guard, in my opinion, than what Gillespie has given Maryland. Just the efficiency with which he's played. I've been really, really impressed. As I say, you can't, you probably can't say he's their best player, but I think you can say he's their most important.
Then we move on to Rodney Rice, 6'4" sophomore transfer from Tech. He's also been a good addition, as Willard kind of hit them all this year, averaging almost 14 points a game, 46, 37, and 82 shooting, a 2-to-1 assist turnover ratio, and solid defender.
Yeah, one of the things when I was talking about adding multi-year guys, Gillespie's got 1 year of eligibility after this, and Rice
Right.
will have 2. Rice he wasn't even the most high-profile guy named Rice to enter the Big Ten this year, but he's been the better of them when you compare him to the kid that Indiana added. He's just been great. I mean, almost 14 a game, good shooting, decent secondary playmaker. Um, good defensively. I mean, he got it right, and I do think that to a large extent, the stuff that people talk about, whoa, he's really, really great in terms of the way he handles the portal. I think it's almost like, working with the I Ching. And, you're throwing sticks and
Yeah.
you hope that it turns up right. I mean, I really do think that's often the case. I'm trying to remember. I was reading about John Tange, who we'll be talking about next week, Wisconsin's best player. And he's a guy that's been around. He played at Colorado State. He'd been at Missouri. He didn't really play there much. Um, and now he's at Wisconsin. Do you know how long Greg Gard spent with John Tange recruiting him? 2 hours.
2 hours. Yeah.
2 hours.
Yeah.
And as somebody who was talking about this pointed out, they said he spent 2 hours with the guy who became his best player this year, and he probably spent about 300 hours recruiting a kid named Daniel Freitag, who may end up being a good player eventually for Wisconsin, but is the 11th man on their team this year.
Yeah.
So make it make sense,
Yeah. I,
So I don't
yeah.
want to look, Kevin Willard's done a really nice job with this team. I don't want to denigrate that or pretend that none of that matters. But let's be honest, he happened to have some good fortune here. But
Sure.
it's true to say this team, it's worked very well. Rodney Rice has proven to be a great addition. And the thing I do like about it that I think you can give a coach some credit for is if you're adding multi-year guys as opposed to one and dones, I think you're giving yourself, obviously, this is a simple thing, but it bears repeating. You're giving yourself a better chance to end up having some continuity, right? If you can get more than 1 year out of these guys and they actually fit your program, as it looks like these guys from Maryland have, that's probably better than the constant, Underwoodian churn of your roster from year to
Yeah.
year to year.
Of course, the risk there is if someone doesn't fit, then you're stuck with them for 2, 3
Well,
years
then you
now.
just get rid of them. Then you
Well,
just
I guess in
encourage them to
today's
leave, right?
transactional, yeah, the transactional
I
nature
mean,
of
that's
things,
the
yeah.
reality. Whether
Yeah,
nobody
right.
wants to cop to that, but that's the reality.
Yeah, right. All right, well, the third transfer we'll talk about is Sullivan Miguel, the 6'4" senior from South Florida, started at K-State, which was the transfer haven. That's where everyone said there's a guy who figured it out. There he's averaging almost 12 points a game, shooting 44, 44, and 73.
Yeah, again, really, really efficient shooting numbers. And he's also a guy that I think has fit in defensively with what Willard wants to do as well. He's that more conventional, this is his last go around.
Right.
Um, so he's more of what you typically think of when you talk about portal additions, but he's proven to be really good. And when you mentioned at the outset or near the outset, trying to project what this team would be, let's look at what we're talking about. So these three guys, we're talking about Miguel, a guy who was at South Florida. It was okay there, but who the hell knows how a
Yeah.
guy functioned. Rodney Rice had played 1 year, solid year at Virginia Tech, didn't set the world on fire. And then Jacoby Gillespie had been good at Belmont, but he was coming from Belmont. So
Right.
you look at this in the preseason and you say, well, there's a giant question mark as to how those guys. I didn't even think all three of these guys would be starters. I thought two of them would. It's ended
Mhm.
up being these three, but it's
Yeah.
panned
So,
out. It's
yeah.
worked. And this is the reality of the modern game. And I was just talking a second about Indiana, who's actually playing well today, but everybody was in love with Indiana because they loved on paper the way their portal class looked. Well, how's that worked out? You know, this is the reality of modern college basketball that in an ever increasing way, you just are not going to know for sure what any team does or doesn't have. And
Yeah.
for Maryland, it's played out great.
All right, moving on to Derrick Queen. He's 6'10", 250-pound freshman. He's a McDonald's All-American, and he has become even more than I think probably his build is going to be. He's almost averaging 16 points a game, which is tops of the team, 9.1 rebounds a game, which is second on the team, pulls down about a block a game as well, and has a couple assists a game as too. He does turn the ball over quite a bit, but still really good for a freshman, shooting 55, 9, and 77. And that 77% is impressive because he does average almost 6 free throw attempts a game. So he is, and he's a guy who, no matter how many times I watch him, I never think like he's playing hard. Yet he seems to be productive, and he kind of reminds me a little of Zach Randolph. He's not like he doesn't look like he's got a super great build right now. You know, he's not worked at his body and does not look like he's out there hustling a ton, but just gets a lot of stuff done. He's just kind of elite with footwork, I guess.
Physically, I can see that comparison. Derrick Queen's a guy that at the next level is going to have to tighten up his body for sure. But and I think that's because that's the reason why you're seeing him the way you are
Yeah, for
is
sure.
that he doesn't look like he's super athletic, although I think he's a better athlete than you might assume looking at him.
Yep.
Um, but he's just been tremendous. I mean, the Big Ten absolutely loaded with great freshmen. You always start these conversations with the two guys at Rutgers, and then you
Hmm.
move to, you talk about uh, a couple of the kids at Illinois. Certainly talk about Jace Richardson. I would say, though, what really stands out to me about Queen is along with Jace Richardson, those are the two guys that I think are closing the best among
Yeah.
freshmen in this league. Like those two guys, you could make a pretty good case, are playing their best basketball now, which is not normally the way it goes for a freshman, or at least not always. So I think he's really, really good. He's their best player. I said I think Gillespie's their most important player. He's their best player, and I think it's pretty obvious when you watch them play. Like the number of things he can do well in a game is not normal for a big kid because he does have, even though he still makes more mistakes than you'd like, that playmaking ability. He's actually got a handle. I will not be surprised, even though that 9% looks awful from three, and smartly he doesn't take a ton of them. He kind of got into a period earlier in the year where he started jacking them a little bit, and they've managed to rein it in. So credit to Kevin Willard for that, I guess.
Some coaches actually rein in the bad
Yeah,
3 point
some,
attempts.
but I'm not going to be surprised. In fact, I would be more surprised if he doesn't end up adding a reliable jumper as his pro career goes on. I suspect he will. He just seems like that kind of talent. And it's going to come down to work ethic, obviously, and that's going to determine just how good he is in the NBA as well. But as a college player, man, he's not too many better than him in their first year. I'll say that.
Yeah, and it's the unfair thing about getting that McDonald's All American tag because it's easy to point to this and say, well, if you've got a McDonald's All American, point to Xavier Booker, for instance, and he's not what people expected. He wanted more. There are a lot of people who are McDonald's All Americans in some respects, right? They're what, like 20 a year? Is that
Yeah.
probably about right? Yeah.
Yep.
So they're not all 20 going to be in
A
the
little more
NBA,
than
right? I
that.
mean,
Little more
yeah.
than that.
So
Right.
whatever. I mean, it's and everyone develops their own pace and and it depends on the year. All right. So moving on to Julian Reese. He's the longtime Terrapin, 6'9", 250-pound senior. He is averaging 14 points a game, 9.3 rebounds a game, blocks about 1.5 shots a game, and shooting 59% from the floor and 74% from the line. So he and Queen clearly, they're each averaging what combined about 2.5 blocks a game. That's part of the reason Maryland's 2-point defense is so good.
I thought because he was good as a freshman, he was raw, but you could see he was going to be a player.
Yeah.
It was obvious early. And I remember thinking, I probably even verbalized it at one point or another on this podcast, that the key to me was going to be, can he do what some other Maryland players managed to do in the past at his position, like somebody like Bruno Fernando, for example, where
Mhm.
he ended up developing a jumper as time went on. Some of them, like Stick Smith, was an example of a guy who had it when he
Right.
got there. He was versatile. But I thought, well, that's the thing that's going to enable Reese to take the next big leap in his game is when he adds something else offensively. Because he was raw early on. He's never managed to do that, but I still think I was probably wrong because he's ended up just getting a little better every year. And you look at where he's at now, and that guy's a load. And he
Yeah.
knows who he is, and he plays within himself. He's not jacking jumpers. Everything's around the rim. Very good rebounder, very good rim protector. And he's gotten to be a 74% shooter at the line too, which, as you said about Queen, but it matters for Reese too, even though he doesn't take as many free throws. That's a we know this from watching Michigan State, right? That's a bonus when you've got a Carson
Yeah.
Cooper or a Jackson Kohler that are going to draw fouls, and or Cohen Carr even, although he's not a true big, but guys that are going to draw fouls because of their activity around the basket, and you feel good about them going to the line and knocking a couple down. It's a huge deal, and Maryland has that.
So this is not quite a cliff drop going to the reserves and the bench for Maryland, but it's pretty close. You'll see kind of what the big difference is for the bench and the starters. Starting with Deshaun Harris-Smith, he's a 6'5" sophomore. He's a big recruit last year. He started a lot of last season. This year's only started a couple games. He's averaging only 2.8 points a game, 2.5 rebounds a game, playing about 16 minutes, shooting 39, 19, and 56.
Yeah, he was. I mentioned I only thought two of the three newcomers were going to start, and it's because I figured that Harris Smith would be a starter, and he did start early, but they moved off that quickly, got Rice into the starting lineup, and that's been the right move. Um, it's fair to say Harris Smith has been a disappointment, while at the same time acknowledging he matters for this team because he's the one guy off that bench that plays steady minutes. And the reason he does is even though the offense has not come along, he can defend. And he's got good size at 6'5" too on the
Mhm.
wing. So he plays a role. It's just, it's not, I think they thought he was going to be a really good all around wing. And the first 2 years, at least, that has not quite happened.
Then we have Jay Young, 6'2" senior transfer from Memphis. He's averaging 2.3 points a game in about 12 minutes, shooting 39, 40, and 75.
Yeah, good efficiency numbers. It's on very limited volume. Obviously, you only average 2 points a game. You're not taking many shots. He's the 12 minutes a game. He's contributing, but this is at best this is really a true like 7-man playing group. They'll play more guys than that, but I mean what it equates to in terms of adding all the reserve minutes up. It's really more like a 7-man rotation.
Then we have Jordan Geronimo, 6'6". I think is he a fifth year senior this year? I feel like he
Yeah.
played,
Yep.
yeah, this is a COVID year. He came over from Indiana. He's averaging only 2.3 points a game, 2.1 rebounds a game, playing only about 9 minutes, shooting 54, 25, and 50. Those numbers clearly show why he's only playing 9 minutes a game.
Yeah, and he's another guy. Geronimo has some versatility as a defensive player. He's always been an eye-popping athlete,
Yeah,
and I'm a little bit surprised that he didn't develop more because I sometimes this is what happens whenever you see a freshman kind of show out, even if they're not a develop. Like I talked about Julian Reese, right? You could
right.
see as a freshman, hey, this guy's raw, but there's something there. He's probably going to be a player. And then we have just a natural tendency to project and assume that they're going to develop in a linear fashion from
Yeah,
there.
right.
Well, it's happened with Julian Reese. It has not happened with Jordan Geronimo. I would argue Jordan Geronimo is no better today, certainly not offensively, than he was 4 years ago. It just hasn't changed. And that's a little surprising to me, but maybe it shouldn't be because, as I say, it's not a given that you're going to get better.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, he's at 9 minutes a game, not a big role.
And then finally, is it Tafari Gapar or
Yep,
Tafari Gapar? Yeah. 6'9", 215-pound junior transfer from Georgia Tech, averaging 4.2 points a game, 2.3 rebounds a game, 12 minutes, shooting 50, 38, 63. He's clearly their reserve big man to come in.
correct. He gives those guys, Reese and Queen are both right around the 28-minute a night mark. So sometimes they'll only go with one big, and then Gapar is playing the other available minutes. But, you could see from the minutes played here, this is not a Michigan State deal, to put it kindly. You
Right.
know, this is a really good starting lineup, and then that's kind of it.
All right. So who do you have as Michigan State's player to keep in the gutter? I'm a little interested in how
Well,
you're going to
I
cook
think I've
this.
been telegraphing it in
Well,
my discussion about this
I think
because Derek
so.
Derek Queen's their best player. I don't think anyone would argue with that. He's the guy with the most potential, and he actually is their best player, especially right now. But I'm going to go with Gillespie,
Yeah, I wondered
and
if that's yeah.
I say that because any team that's got a high level point guard, that's I think where you start is you got to deal with that guy because he's the engine that makes the whole thing go. And he's so important to them at both ends. I just think, you look at the way Michigan State has played some pretty good guards recently. The job they did on Braden Smith. I think the job they did, a little less of a challenge, but the job they did on Trey Donaldson the other
Yeah.
night. And this is one, I put this closer to the Braden Smith category because Gillespie really is a guy. He's not just a scorer. He's going to set the table and create for everybody too. He's the hub of this thing. And so can Michigan State's guards do a decent job at least of reducing his efficiency? I don't think you're going to stop him from scoring. I don't think you're going to prevent him from recording any assists. But can you make him really have to work for what he gets? Kind of like what they did with Braden Smith. Can
Right.
they do that kind of job?
All right. So that brings us to Clean Glass Best, brought to you by the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. If you need your windows cleaned or your house cleaned, contact the Squeegee Squad. They are professionals. They do a great job. They're a big, large region in the Metro Grand Rapids area. Give them a call. They get out their ladders. They'll take care of all that stuff that you really aren't going to do, nor do you want to do. So stay off the ladders. Have those pros do it for you. And to be glad you did, you can do other stuff that's more important than falling off the ladder. So call the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. You can find ways to contact them at our support page at the final floor, schedule.com/support. 15% off as a listener to the show. If you mention Final Four when you get your estimate from Troy and his team, you won't regret it. And so right now the standings are 13-9. The magic number with 4 to go in the regular season is 4. So I get to pick first this time because I actually had a comeback win last week, and because I think Kohler has not been doing it for us. But I'm going to go with Kohler as my first pick still in the snake draft because I think he's due to get a big day again.
All right. Cooper is my obvious first choice with the way
Right.
he's been rebounding.
Naturally.
And then, again, you got the dilemma. You're facing a big team.
Yep. So Paul's
Does
gonna play
that
a lot of
mean
minutes.
you go with Zapala, or do you go? I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go with a shocker. How's this? I'm taking
Oh,
Jace Richardson.
oh man. Going off the board. Now he did have 4 rebounds last
He had
game.
6, I
Yeah. Oh,
think,
6.
wasn't it?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, he had 6. He had 4 defensively. Yeah, 2 offensive rebounds.
Yeah,
Yeah, right.
I'm gonna go with
Um,
Jace.
all right. Well, and I think the key here is having someone who's going to play a decent amount of minutes. And so I'm going to go with Carr. I think he's going to play quite a bit. He seems to be playing a lot of minutes, and he's very impactful. The last game against Michigan, I think he's kind of figuring it out, and I think they'll need him in this game too, quite a bit, especially on the wing. So anyway, I'll go with Carr, and we'll see who comes up with who cleans the last best. Brought to you by the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. Brings us to the 5 keys of the game. Brought to you by Nudge Printing. Actually, I had looked it up because I always say that Nudge Printing has apparel from all sorts of different schools in the state of Michigan. So I wrote them all down. So if you want something from Elma, Calvin, Central Michigan, Eastern Michigan, Ferris State, Grand Valley State, Michigan Tech, Northern Michigan, Oakland, Wayne State, Western Michigan, and of course, your beloved Spartans, you want to head over to Nudge Printing. My wife just ordered some stuff yesterday, a Michigan State mom shirt, and then also a sticker for my daughter's computer. She needs a big Michigan State sticker sit in the middle of her laptop. It's just what kids do nowadays. They put stickers all over it. So you can head on over there. They've got great stickers, obviously apparel, very comfortable stuff. I've talked about it all the time. It's really great. You get 20% off. You just type in Final Four with the coupon code, and they'll ship it to you within a few days. And you have great stuff from a Michigan company, Michigan State, and then for Michigan State in the state of Michigan. All right. So begin with the first key of the game is the atmosphere. Maryland is not what it was 10 years ago. It's really, I feel like since COVID, maybe a little before, it just kind of like got in the dwindles of Turgeon, and it's never really kind of gotten back to that. It seemed like an insane sort of place to play, and it doesn't seem that way anymore. But it's obviously a good team having a good year, and it's on the road.
Well, in their old place, it was Cole Fieldhouse, I think was the name of their gym. Uh, During the Lefty Drizel and Gary Williams eras. I guess I can't speak for the Bob Wade era. That was a little bit of a down a down period for them. But for most of my life, Maryland was an extremely difficult place to play in. And it added up because you had good teams that were often in the hunt in the ACC and relevant nationally. And because of that, and I think also the culture of the conference they were in, Maryland had always struck me as this is a basketball first kind of place.
Yeah.
Maybe not quite the way that say Indiana and Purdue are, but pretty close. And I think that continued even in their new building, where when Gary Williams was coach there, and to the first period when Mark Turgeon was there. But I do agree. I think at some point late, and do you remember how things just got stale? There were about 4 or 5 years running where it seemed like, wow, Mark Turgeon's on the hot seat. Is this going to be the year that he goes? And then he
Right.
finally ended up resigning. But it was part of the reason you would feel that way was that you could sense it in their fan base. Like there had just been a loss of faith. And I think it happened with a couple of the teams they had since they joined the Big Ten, where it looked on paper that they would be a contender, not just in the league, but nationally. And then for one reason or another, it just never worked out. He never went on a real run in
Mhm.
March. And I think that all sort of served to not completely sideline the fan base, but that we've seen it at other schools, right? Where you just sense the enthusiasm kind of slipping away. And I think that happened in Maryland. And then, as you say, then COVID hit, and it has not bounced back fully to what it once was. That said, in recent games I have watched there this season, it seems to me like they're getting closer. They're not, I wouldn't argue that they're all the way back, but they're getting closer. And I do think, as I've said a few times in this podcast, I do think their fans would be foolish not to buy into this team. I don't
Yeah.
mean that they're going to necessarily win the national championship, but they're good. They're legitimately good. And there's no reason to not believe that this team is capable of having a lot of fun over the next month. I think they're good enough that they can do that. So, anyway, you add all that up. What does that mean? Well, as I alluded to, I think you can maybe make an argument that this could be the toughest game Michigan State plays all year in the Big Ten because it's on the road in a place that maybe isn't back to their peak, but is starting to get better. And you're playing a really good team in their building. So
Mhm.
all of those things add up to a difficult situation. I think that over the last, week and a half, we've seen this Michigan State team twice in hostile environments prove that they are capable of playing well in that kind of situation, doing it at Illinois, doing it at Michigan. They've proven enough to me, regardless of what happens in this game. This is a good road team. They've shown
Yeah.
they have the stuff to be considered that. Can they do it again?
Yeah. What are they, 6-2 on the road so far this year? I think that's right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, sure, that would be
impressive.
right. That would
Yeah.
be right. Yeah, that's impressive. That's impressive for anybody.
Yeah. No matter who
Um,
you're playing.
yeah, and in any high major conference, that's impressive.
All right. Moving on to the second key to the game is the transition game. There's often a key for Michigan State. Maryland likes to play fast. Michigan State, obviously, they like to play fast, especially in transition, off made baskets or misses or free throws, whatever. I guess, how's it going to go for Michigan State here?
Yeah, it'll be interesting
Yeah, yeah,
because I think Kevin Willard's a good coach, and I would think he'll have his team about as well prepared as he can to they both teams will come into this game well rested. Maryland last played, what was it, on Thursday night, Michigan State
against
on
USC.
Friday,
Yeah,
and then they don't play this game until Wednesday. So, 6 days for Maryland, 5 days for Michigan State. I would think that getting back in transition has been drilled and drilled and drilled with the Maryland players. But as it keeps being said, and our friend and broadcaster extraordinaire Robbie Hummel has said it several times this year on broadcasts of Michigan State games, that the single most difficult prep he ever had as a player at Purdue was for Michigan State, because you knew what they were going to do, and it requires a ton of focus and obviously a ton of energy to be able to deal with that. And when it's your first time seeing it, it's a shock.
yeah,
And these are his words, not mine. And Maryland's got four guys in that starting lineup who have never seen it. And we've talked earlier in this episode about how refreshing it is and different it is to see so many teams in the Big Ten playing fast, and that's true. But none of them play fast the way Michigan State does.
right.
Michigan State actually isn't as fast as many of those teams in terms of their half court offense, but nobody plays transition basketball like Michigan State. So, can Michigan State find opportunities to get easy points in this game? Some of the things you would expect might give you a chance for that are probably going to be off the table. Maryland doesn't turn the ball over very much. So while you'd love to get a lot of live ball turnovers, I don't think you can fairly go into this game expecting it.
Yeah,
Maryland also is not a great offensive rebounding team, as we've said, but might that mean that we see them just kind of prioritize floor balance and not even try very much, which might also limit the number of times you can get, an odd man advantage on the break. Those are all things that are going to matter, but you just have to hope that Maryland gets caught sleeping a little bit due to lack of familiarity and experience in dealing with what Michigan State does.
all right. So the third key of the game is the foul line. Obviously, strange Maryland team in the sense that they don't get a lot of free throw attempts in the game. Michigan State kind of feast there when they because they shoot so well, and they actually get their pretty good clip as well. And of late, they haven't gotten there quite as much, but I think we are every expectation that they're going to try and get there as much as they can.
Yeah, it's so this is how I see it. It's unlikely that Maryland's going to get there a ton. It would be an unusual circumstance. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but that's not the way it's gone for them this year. So then the question really becomes, how often can MSU get there? MSU gets there on the season at a very good clip.
Mhm.
But the trouble is, Maryland doesn't foul people very much, and they're
Right.
at home. So you would expect they're not going to get a tough whistle. We'll have to see. Does Michigan State, even considering all that, is Michigan State able to force those fouls, force Maryland into having to foul? That would be a big deal. The other thing is, and it's not being talked about a ton because Michigan State's won these last three games, but over this three-game winning streak, one thing they haven't done as well is hit the free throws they do get. You mentioned they
Right.
haven't shot as many. And that was true, I think, in the Illinois game and in the Michigan game. I think in the Purdue game, their attempts were actually more or less on par.
Yeah.
But in those other two games, they didn't shoot as many, but they also haven't been making as many. I mean, this is a team that's been incredible
Yeah.
over the course of the season. There haven't been any disaster games. They haven't had a game where they shot 50%, but they've been in the 60s, high 60s.
Right.
That's not this team. So it's two things. It's get there and it's get back to hitting them the way you have during the course of the season.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the not hitting him has been really result of Carr has missed a couple, and Cooper has really
Cooper,
struggled from the
yeah.
line, and he's been
But
playing
even
more
some of the
minutes, and
other
he's been
guys,
getting more.
even some of the other guys like
Yeah,
Holloman and
Trey missed
Richardson that are
one.
high 80s guys are missing
Right,
free throws here and there. Akins at Michigan, I think, missed two, didn't he? He's an
maybe.
80% plus
Yeah,
guy. So it's been everybody.
yeah, that's true. All right, so the fourth key of the game is the bigs. Michigan State has gone up against quite a few recently. I mean, you look at Illinois, they had Ivizic to take care of, and Johnson, who ended up getting hurt at the end of the game. And then, of course, against Michigan, you had Area 51. You had to deal with Trey Kaufman-Renn at Purdue. And so here, you got Queen and Reese you've got to deal with. No one beyond those two, but certainly they're going to be a challenge, a different sort of challenge, especially with the way Queen has been playing.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing to say, well, who's the better combination between these two guys and the two guys Michigan has?
Yeah.
They're different.
Hmm.
Queen, as I've said, Queen is a capable playmaker at times. He can pass, he can handle, but he's not used the way Wolf is. I mean, Michigan, Wolf is their de facto point guard. I mean, he
Right.
really is. That's not the case with Queen. But I, there's just something in me that says these two guys at Maryland, I like just a touch better. And maybe it's because I think as a combo, they're better on the boards, and I think they're a little better defensively. But
Hmm.
regardless of you can flip a coin as to which one's better between those two groups, and I could understand people going the other way. I don't think it's a case closed sort of scenario, but it's going to be a challenge for Michigan State. And the problem is when it's two guys that play together a fair amount, what do you do with that? Because when it's one guy who's really the primary low post threat, okay, well, that's a little easier. You can make a decision like when Michigan State was facing Purdue and you're dealing
Right.
with Kaufman-Renn. He's the only guy. So it's a little more clear cut. Are you going to send a double? Are you going to dig? Are you going to play him straight up? I think when there's two guys, both of whom can do damage in the post, they've proven they play well together, which is not a given
Right.
with guys like that, where neither one's a stretch threat. I really wondered about that at the start of the season with Maryland. Well, they've blown that out of the water. They obviously function well together. But it creates a challenge because you can't double them both, or at least it's not easy to. Um, and especially given that Queen is a good passer, you run a risk. If you're doubling off Reese, you run a real risk because Queen can find him.
Hmm.
So I'm going to be interested to see how Michigan State matches up. I'm kind of inclined to believe that, especially in the beginning, they'll probably try to play it straight up, maybe with occasional perimeter digging. But again, even there, you got to be careful because all three of these starting perimeter guys can hit jumpers. So who do you come off is an open question, and I'm not sure there's a really good answer for that. So I'm inclined to think you probably, as best you can, try to play them straight up. But we'll
Yeah.
see what
I
MSU opts to do.
I think you're right. This is kind of where you play your base defense and just these sort of typical gap help,
Yep.
and then make sure you stay on your man so you can rebound if there's a miss. Right. I think that's kind of what you do
Yep.
because and this is a game too where Michigan State obviously has more depth for the bigs. They've got three you say are very good, and you could throw Booker in there as a fourth if you needed
Yep.
to, sort of like an emergency. However, from a foul standpoint, we saw this in the Indiana game. It became a real problem from foul trouble with their bigs.
Yeah. The
You certainly
only
can see that here too with these two guys who can offensively
well,
do quite a bit.
maybe. I mean, the saving grace there is at least based on the numbers, based on the season, Maryland doesn't put you in foul trouble consistently.
Right.
But you're right. Could it happen? Yes.
All right. And so the fifth and final key to the game is no Moss. You missed the accent there. I couldn't do it with the all caps here, but but we noticed this at the end of the Michigan game, and it's become apparent. I think I heard a stat was like Michigan State has outscored the last three games 29-7. The last, I don't know, 4 minutes of the game for the last three games. Teams are just completely wearing down, I think, both physically and mentally, as we talked about in the last show after the Michigan game. This is a team with really five players and then a couple guys who come in and spell them for a blow or two for 4 minutes or so. This is a team you could theoretically really by the end of the season, maybe the bench makes a big difference here.
Yeah, it's definitely been a pattern. We've seen it in these last three games, and truthfully, we've seen signs of it all year, the positive impact of Michigan State's depth, but I think it's becoming more pronounced the deeper in the season we get because, as we've talked about, it's not even just how many minutes a guy is playing in a given game, it's also the cumulative effect of all the minutes they've been playing all year long. And now that we're in the back end of February, if that's going to show up, this is when you'd see it. And for three games running, it's shown up. Michigan State has owned winning time. And a big part of it, in I think both of our opinions, is that Michigan State is the fresher team when you get to those moments in a game. Maryland would be an example of a team that, at least in theory, could be vulnerable to that because they don't play their bench very much. As I've said, I think when you add it all up, you're really talking about more the equivalent of a 7-man rotation, even though we'll probably see 9 actually play.
Right.
Those, not all 4 of those guys are getting serious minutes. So the question becomes, if the game is close and we start hitting, 6 minutes, 5 minutes left, do we see it show up again in a way that benefits Michigan State, where all of a sudden they're making every play on a loose ball?
Right. Yeah.
They're tattooing them on the offensive glass. Maryland shooters are coming up short when they take a shot, whereas Michigan State is able to finish. Do we see all of those things show up again the way that they have in the last 3 games? And I think if it's a tight game, and that's what you hope it is, at least tight for Michigan State being a worst case scenario, that's what you hope for. That this will be a factor. That Michigan State just kind of wearing an opponent down over the course of 40 minutes gives them an advantage at the point of that last push to the finish line.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, and the thing that it's hard to quantify is the mental fatigue too. And I do think Michigan State's a tough scout, and it's one that you can, especially when you're tired, you can make more mistakes as far as not recognizing tendencies of certain players and having them sort of hurt you in ways they may not have been doing earlier in the game. So I think that's part of that whole fatigue issue.
Yep. Well, I think the mental part of it absolutely is a factor. And you mentioned one aspect of it, which is the difficulty in scouting Michigan State. But then we also come back to what we talked about earlier, having to deal with Michigan State in transition. That's not just a physical thing. That's a mental thing that you've had to think about any hard physical repetitive task that you have to do in your life or at any point in your life over the course of a stretch of time. Like, it's not just 30 seconds and then it's done.
Right.
It's over and over and over and over. Yeah, that takes a toll physically, but that also takes a toll mentally as well. When you've got to be that locked in, because it's not normal. You don't know. This is what I mean about guys not being used to seeing what Michigan State does. It's not normal to have to know after your team has made a basket, I got to bust my ass immediately to
Right.
get back on defense. Because if I don't, they're going to put one right down our throat. That's not usual. And so that's physical energy you're exerting, but it's also mental energy. And so that goes along with what you're saying about the difficulty of the scout too. Is Michigan State presents a lot of challenges that I don't think are readily acknowledged by a lot of people that are watching these games.
Yeah. It's funny just thinking about that too, is like, an offensive rebound, for instance, giving up one of those up mentally, that's gotta be really a struggle too, besides
That
being sort of
that's another
demoralizing.
way.
But
Absolutely.
yeah, those things can really add up and become a real challenge to a team. So yeah, we'll see if that comes. So I expect it's going to show up again in this game. And so this is one of those games where you might just say, well, as long as you just kind of stay within contact up until the end, then you at least may feel better about this game. Michigan State comes to this game. Magic number is 4. So we're recording this before Michigan plays at Nebraska on Monday night. So potentially it may just be they may only need 3 wins in order to win the Big Ten if coming into this game against Maryland. I think obviously I like Michigan State's chances right now going for the Big Ten title. I mean, I think there's a reason you should because I think they match up really well against Michigan, and I don't trust Michigan quite as much as I trust Michigan State. Now maybe their schedule a little bit kinder. I'm not sure, but
No,
uh,
not much, not
yeah.
much.
So, and I mean, as we're seeing, it looks like at this point Purdue is lost, and so they're kind of out of the double bye situation. I would think this would be what 6 losses or 7 losses for
No,
now.
they're not out of the double
That'd be the
bye, but
6 losses, right?
they're definitely behind the 8 ball
Yeah. Like
because
I
that
think
puts
you
them one back of Maryland and Wisconsin.
right. So, you think probably I'm guessing there's gonna be someone a double bye with the 7 losses through like tiebreakers makes it in, or 6 maybe. I think 6 losses you for
6.
sure
I
get
wouldn't
in.
say 7.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think about it, because UCLA has 6 losses, right? I think,
Yep.
and then
Big one against Ohio State today at Pauley.
right, which is one that you'd expect it. It is interesting how the conference is really kind of tough to figure out because just when you think you know what's going on, then something weird happens. Like Northwestern goes into Columbus and wins by like almost
Right.
30 points.
Yep.
So I don't know. I mean, it's the nice thing is I think the team I feel most confident with, at least from a consistency level, is Michigan State. Oh, and
Absolutely.
I guess that's the one question we didn't even talk about that everyone freaks out about. So when it comes to the zone, I thought they did okay against Michigan with the zone. And we kind of talked about it that Michigan went into it, but at times they were sort of giving up too much on the zone, at least from a rebounding standpoint. And they weren't stopping Michigan State from getting decent shots either any differently than I think they were on man. I don't know. I'm guessing Maryland probably doesn't usually play zone. Is that something that Michigan State's going to see much of in this game? Do you have
I
any
would,
feel for that?
I gotta say, I don't yet have enough of a feel for Willard. Is he a gambling man? Is he meaning would he say, well, we don't play heavy zone, but we're gonna in this game? No, Maryland is not a zone team, and the best way you can tell is that they're top 30 in the country in defensive rebounding.
Right. Yeah,
That'd be
exactly.
more or less impossible for a zone team to put up. Might they bust it out occasionally in this game? Sure, they could do that. But I expect to see a lot of man.
All right. Well, I think we'll leave it there and we'll be back live. And again, we've had really great response from live. Please come and join us live after the game. We'll be on, I think it's a 6:30 Eastern start. So it's actually a pretty nice time. So we should be on around sometime before 9, theoretically. So we'll be on. Make sure if you've not had a chance, go over to YouTube and go to youtube.com/at TFFINOTS. You can find us there. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell if you've not yet. Just that way, make sure you can, make sure you'll get the notification if we go live and when new shows drop. So, and of course, if you listen to podcasts, player just in your car or on the treadmill or wherever you listen and consume our stuff, please continue doing so and make sure you subscribe as well. Head over to our support page at tiffnots.com/support if you want to find any other ways to support the show. So until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go green.